One of the least friendly places on Earth. A place where people rarely make eye contact, let alone speak to each other. Yet on the 7th of July 2005, when a bomb was detonated at Edgware Road, there were passengers who risked their own lives to save strangers. Most have never spoken about it publicly. Few have received any credit for their actions. To commemorate the anniversary of 7/7, we set about interviewing those involved. So who were the people whose heroic actions saved lives on that day?
I could have just frozen. I could have turned and run with the rest. I chose to stay and to fight and to work with any of the frights that came along in front of me. And I truly believe I couldn't have done anything different.
And why did they choose to stay and help?
It was that point when I heard this one voice that really stood out from the others, saying, help me, crying out, and you had to go to it.
This is the story of the Angels of Edgware Road. On the 7th of July 2005, suicide bombers attacked 3 tube trains and a bus, killing 52 passengers and injuring hundreds more. Out of the morning rush hour came stories of heroism and survival, and the courage of the emergency services. What was unique about Edgware Road was where the bomb was detonated. It was here, in this stretch of tunnel, just as 2 trains passed side by side. They came to a halt opposite each other. For those in the bombed carriage, it was a nightmare. For those in the carriages next to it and on the train opposite, there was an agonizing moral dilemma: to get away to safety, or to break your way into the bombed carriage and try to save people's lives. The passengers still live with the consequences of that decision. One of those whose life would depend on the help of others on 7/7 was David Gardner, a 50-year-old amateur actor and proud father to a baby boy. He was on his way to work and was engrossed in the script of Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, a play which he was both directing and acting in as Brutus.
It wasn't a packed carriage, but it was a full carriage. There were people standing, so if I'd been more kindly disposed, I might have stood up for someone. I was reading and unaware of anyone there.
To help us to understand the bigger picture, David and the others have drawn simple diagrams to show their positions in the carriage that morning.
This is where I was sitting, and this was where the bomber was. Across the doors.
I always describe it as, to my just slightly left, the sound of a big balloon popping. It sounds sort of banal almost, but just pop! The weird thing was, I still was going through those lines in my head, even while I was flying in the air with bits going all over the place. I felt a bit like Alice going down a rabbit hole, wondering whether I was going to come down alive or dead. I came down in a sort of right-angle position in front of the seat where I was in the middle, on the ground.
On the same train, in the carriage next to the bomb, were 2 women who would have very different experiences that morning. Closest to the bomber was 24-year-old art graduate Susanna Pell, on her way to begin her first day of work experience.
The only way I could describe it was this huge force, this great big gust of hot air, and what felt like a plank of wood whacking me around the head, slam onto my side of my head. That was all the glass coming through from the window. And I was knocked flying into the lap of the person who was sitting next to me. and was knocked unconscious. I woke up and I tried to open my eyes and I couldn't. The weight of all the glass and the debris was so heavy that I couldn't open my eyelids, and I had to sweep the glass off my eyes. I was so dizzy and I couldn't hear, and I couldn't see. I was just plunged into this darkness.
A few feet away was Jackie Putnam, a 54-year-old mother of two.
There was a flash, a noise that sounded like a firework, and then the air was filled with flying glass. But it actually looked rather beautiful. I sort of looked up and I saw all this glass just flying across like it had been shot from a gun.
For those on the bombed train, the experience was terrifying. But what was it like to be on the train next to it? What was it like to see across the tracks, through the carriage windows? This is where teacher Tim Coulson was.
I'd assumed that two trains had collided or hit one another at some point when they were passing, and the air, the atmosphere inside the train suddenly started to fill up with an acrid smoke, a dark, dust-laden, choking, warm air. They opened the pull-down windows between the carriages to allow extra ventilation, which brought in extra dirt, but it also brought in a sound, and it was a human cry that I have never heard, nor really have any wish to ever hear again.
Taken on board Tim's train, this mobile phone footage captures the horror of that moment. This is what Tim did. He made his way towards the screams coming from the other train. Unable to get the side doors open, smashing through the thick glass windows was the only way to get to the injured.
The actual glass used in the doors is particularly strong. It's very thick safety glass, but we knew we had to break that, and we did have more than one attempt at breaking it. It did shatter, very much like a car windscreen, when it decided to go from the point we'd been spearing it. When I went down onto the track and then leapt into the next train, which was about 15 inches away from me.
Tim now found himself in the darkness of the bombed carriage. On the morning of July the 7th, 2005, in a tunnel just outside Edgware Road Station, Tim Coulson had smashed his way out of his train in an attempt to reach injured passengers in the bombed train opposite. It was an incredibly brave thing to do, made all the more courageous by the fact that Tim is partially sighted, his left eye lost to cancer.
To be in darkness with less than normal vision is a real challenge, but I do have a pair of hands and use those effectively to find my way across the carriage. But it was a very black space from my point of view, and a very frightening one. I became aware that on my right there was a corpse on a seat in a pool of blood, and it was burnt, and it was not going to move again. I think I don't remember consciously making decisions, but must have subconsciously thought, there's nothing you can do for that person, move to somewhere where you can be of help. I continued to move forward very carefully across the dark floor to give assistance to a gentleman who was part in and part out of a crater created in the floor, and that was Stan. Stan was in a poor state of health. He'd got no shirt on, it had been blown away by the bomb. He was breathing, and his eyes were open, and he was looking forward.
Tim climbed out of the train to see if he could free Stan from the crater.
As I climbed out onto the side of the track, I put my hands underneath and found the reason why he wasn't going to live long. The bottom half of his body had been severed from the top. A great deal of blood, obviously, at that point. He died soon after. The body, when it gives up in muscle terms, relaxes. He fell. I lowered him to the track and closed his eyes out of a sense of respect and dignity for him. I did say a short prayer, as not knowing whether that was important to him, but that I hoped whatever he believed in, wherever he was going, that he had a safe journey. Couldn't I just stop at that point?
It would take the emergency services 45 minutes to reach them, even though the trains were only a few hundred yards into the Edgware Road tunnel. The first responders were desperate to help, but there was chaos on the streets of London. 3 bombs had been detonated at the same time on different parts of the underground network. And to begin with, it was unclear what exactly had happened and where.
Let's move to the side, please. Move to the side, please, sir.
In the confusion, some of the emergency services were even sent to the wrong stations. Meanwhile, passengers on the 2 trains stuck in the Edgware Road tunnel were told to make their way through the carriages and out onto the track, and there was soon a mass exodus of people in the tunnel. But some went the other way. Susanna Pell was one of these heroic passengers. Knocked unconscious by the blast, Susanna awoke covered in debris, her hearing damaged from the shockwaves. Hundreds of tiny fragments of glass had embedded themselves in her face. Blood seeped from her wounds.
I could just taste this acrid, sort of chemical smoke, this alien smell, and I was just struggling, fighting to breathe. And at that point, that was when things changed, because you could start to hear the cries and the screams from people in the next carriage. And it was that point when I heard this one voice that really stood out from the others, desperate, crying and shouting, saying, it's a man's voice saying, please, help me, someone help me, I need a medic. It was just so compelling, you had to respond.
With little more than a GCSE in biology and some medical advice picked up over the years from her parents who were doctors, Susanna made her way towards the darkness of the bombed carriage.
I just got up and went through, and that wasn't easy to do because there was so much sort of debris from the train wreckage in the way, and I climbed over the door frame and went through into that next carriage, where I saw a scene of hell. I could see immediately before me there was debris everywhere and bodies and broken glass, but I couldn't see very far because it was so dark at the other end, and I could just see silhouetted figures. But immediately in front of me there was a dying woman here, and her clothes had been blown off her, so you just saw this sort of naked body with knickers on, and it was all grey from the soot from the blast, and it was just such a sort of powerful image of pure kind of innocence, a body, and just lying there so vulnerable, so exposed, with that sort of naked flesh, and in a situation like that, it's just so wrong. But I was immediately drawn to the voice that I'd heard that had compelled me to come through, which was a young blonde man, and he had a very badly damaged, very badly broken leg, and he had been the one that had been crying out for help.
While Susanna set about saving this man's life, the majority of passengers made their way to safety. Some remain haunted by the fact that they didn't stay and help. Mother of 2, Jackie Putnam, had been in the front carriage of the bombed train and had been concussed by the blast.
And at that point it seemed pretty clear that because there was so much smoke, we thought Well, I thought that there would be fire. And I thought, we're going to die. We can't get out. We're going to die. And every fibre of your body is screaming at you, get out, get out, get out, get out. That's all you can think of. It's run, 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 run. I'm used to being the one that stops the runaway horse, that, you know, that goes to the friend who's in trouble. I'm used to being the capable one. But I couldn't function at all. And I thought about my 2 daughters, and I thought, I don't want to die like this, because I don't want them to spend the rest of their lives wondering how, if I was frightened, or how much I'd suffered.
Back in the bombed carriage, amateur actor David Gardner was still sitting upright on the carriage floor, having been blown from his seat by the explosion.
It was sort of half light, dark. I felt I was in the trenches. I hadn't been, but it felt like a sort of a war experience, you know, sort of in the trenches, that sort of gloomy, black and white, muddy, sort of netherworld. And I remember my hand sort of moving over this mushy, messy, sludgy sort of left side, which I realized must be my leg, and that it was in a very bad way.
Burnt, with broken bones, damage to internal organs, and a shattered left leg oozing blood, David needed medical attention, and fast. The emergency services were on their way, but to begin with, their attention was focused across town at Aldgate, the first station to report the suspected bombing of a train. It took 22 minutes for the first ambulance to arrive at Edgware Road. The walking wounded were already outside, and many needed urgent treatment, but there was still no qualified medical help for those trapped in the bombed train. For now, the lives of the injured depended on the help of their fellow passengers. At the front of the bombed carriage, Susanna Pell looked down to examine the leg of the man she'd gone to help.
It looked really bad. A lot of blood, really mangled, with one of the poles mangled through it. And, right, okay, bit of fibbing, right, your leg's broken, but you're going to be okay, it's fine, it's fine. Okay, we need to elevate it. I knew that was the right thing to do, we had to elevate it. And so I had to pick the leg up and get it round all this mangled metal. And the guy was screaming, it was so painful. And I thought, right, well, I'll put a tourniquet on, that's what they do in the movies. Didn't really know what I was doing. And I had a cream scarf on, and I took it off and tied it up right round the top of the thigh, above the bleeding, and pulled as hard as I could.
In elevating the wound above heart level, Susanna had used her basic medical knowledge to do the right thing. She had almost certainly stemmed the flow of blood, and in doing so, had saved the young man's life. Further down the bombed carriage was 34-year-old ex-military man Jason Rennie. He had also been hurt in the blast, with cuts to his head, hand and leg, caused by flying shrapnel. But despite his own injuries, he had been comforting frightened and wounded passengers. Now he was to meet someone who desperately needed his help.
I felt a tapping on my leg. I can't remember if it was tapping or someone tugging at my trousers. And I turned around and there's this chap, and I think he was saying, "Please, just be careful. You know, don't stand on me." And I looked down, and he was kind of sitting up at the waist with his legs straight out in front of him, facing towards the direction shown where I was. And he was next to the seats. There was seats next to him, and he was just resting on his hands like this. And I then realised that, you know, I'd been walking around this whole place, so there was a good chance I might have stood on his hand.
He'd obviously been helping as many people as he could in the way. He had been in the carriage. He, as I discovered later, had a head wound. It was dripping. I remember it once dropped on me quite cold blood. He also had a hand injury, and yet he was moving around, everyone seeing on, and he came to me, and we swapped names. And for a long time after, it was Jason, David, whatever we impart to each other, we didn't want to lose our names.
With knowledge of first aid from his days in military service, Jason quickly began to check David's injuries.
There was a body lying next to him, and the guy's hand was under David's leg. I wanted to move the hand out just to make the leg comfortable, and I remember putting my hand underneath and feeling it was sticky and warm, and there was blood on it, and lifting it up to get the hand out, and it wasn't rigid. It felt quite jelly-like, as if, you know. So I knew there were some fractures, but I was concerned about the bleeding. There was quite a bit of blood that I could feel when I took my hand away. There was a lot of blood.
Worried that David might have severed his femoral artery and could bleed to death within minutes, Jason took off his shirt and used it to make a tourniquet, which he tied around David's leg. A tourniquet is a drastic step, as cutting off the blood supply usually results in an amputation, so they should only be used in a life and death situation. Jason was right, though. David's condition was critical. But the simple presence of another human being gave David strength.
I always remember that he held on when he was comforting me, and one of the things he said, he would never leave me. Towards that long time we were in that tunnel waiting for help to reach us, that he would never leave, you know, while he could stay with me. He wouldn't run away. That was a good thing to rely on, a strong voice behind me, and he seemed a strong guy, holding my hand.
By the side of the carriage was Tim Coulson. He'd had a passenger die in his arms. Now he moved on to try to save others.
And at that point, a very heartfelt scream was on my left, which was from a young woman. She'd been blasted out with that explosion, with the doors, onto the tube wall, and had fallen to the track and was unconscious. And just returning from that, I moved to her again, telling her my name, and asked if it was all right to check her injuries. She was conscious, frightened, a leg that was very much the wrong shape, and her left eye was swelling up very, very rapidly. By now we'd got tunnel lights, the emergency lights were on there. They're not very many lights, not very bright, but sufficient to see a little bit more of what I was doing. But I had got in my mind a determination to keep this one alive. This one wasn't going to die on me. I managed to assist her to feel comfortable, to realise that somebody was there, and she held my hand very tightly and said, "Would you stay with me, please, Tim?" And I said I would, and I would stay with her until I was told otherwise. "25
minutes after an explosion had ripped through a Circle Line train in a tunnel at Edgware Road Station, the passengers in the bombed carriage were still desperately waiting for the arrival of medical help. For now, the lives of the injured depended on the actions of a handful of selfless strangers. Lying on the carriage floor, David Gardner was fighting for his life.
I felt a draining, but a wish to stay awake. I knew somehow that I must not go to sleep. I'd been trying to be calm. I'd come down. I'd be thinking of Brutus, thinking of Julius Caesar, thinking of my play to come, thinking of would I get to work on time, thinking would I get to the rehearsal, and even would I be able to be in the play, which is only a week away. Thinking of my wife, Angela, thinking of my son, Matthew. However I knew I was in a bad way. but I knew I didn't want to not see them again.
But in Jason Rennie, David had found the support he needed to help him stay alive.
I suppose one of the ways I did it was just by focusing, and for me, my vision really was just Jason holding my hand and saying my name over and talking to me, and me saying his name over.
In the beginning, it wasn't something that I did because I was concerned he was, you know, going to get delirious or pass out or needing to keep him there. But in the end, I realized I needed to keep him talking, you know. I would ask him his name. I'd ask him to try and remember his date of birth again. David, just remind me again. I'd pretend like I'd forgotten it. And I'd ask him for his date of birth again, just so that he'd need to string together conscious thoughts to keep himself awake. I didn't want him falling asleep.
By the side of the bombed carriage, Tim Coulson was sitting with Alison, the injured woman he had found on the tracks. Using his knowledge of first aid, he checked her for neck and spinal injuries to ensure he didn't do any damage before making her more comfortable. Now, Tim did his best to keep Alison talking.
We talked about who she was, where she came from, why she was in London, why I was in London. We swapped stories about holidays and a whole range of other things to distract her as much as I could from what her reality and mine were was, are we going to be found? Is there going to be anything else? We didn't know. And I was desperate to never show my fear to her because I could help and had helped her this far and would hope to continue to do so, and didn't want to deter her from any positive thought. I lied. I had no idea who was coming or when.
The underground network had now been closed down, and commuters made their way to work by foot. Survivors from the bombed trains in other parts of London were now spilling out onto the streets and being tended to by the emergency services. Ambulance crews were stretched to breaking point. Outside Edgware Road Station, they were so overwhelmed with patients that at 9:21, one crew reported that it was running out of equipment. This was the last official record made by the ambulance service at Edgware Road that morning. By now, word had reached Susanna Pell that there was a way to escape through the front of the train. But Susanna wasn't finished yet. Having already saved one man, she wanted to do more to help before she left.
I just shouted out, anyone able to walk, come with me now. No one could hear, they'd all lost their hearing in the blast. And so I turned to look at these two guys who were on the twin seats immediately to my left, and they're just staring into space, just shocked. And I just tried to catch their eye and signal to them, and they caught my eye and they lifted up, and I was like, right, okay, come with me, signalling, and they're like, yeah. I was like, took one of them by the hand, it's like, what's your name? It's like, Danny. It's like, right, Danny, come with me. And this great big guy, twice the size of me, and I had to pull him through the doorway, which wasn't easy because it was all covered in mangled metal and it was really tight and constricted. I was like, right, come on, let him through, hold his hand tightly, and got him through to the front of the carriage, and then we were helped down the ladder by the driver.
Now clear of the train, Susanna and the others who'd left through the front carriage found themselves stuck in the tunnel. In their path up ahead, in the gap between the train and the tunnel wall, there were injured passengers. It was here that Tim Coulson was treating Alison. Jackie Putnam saw Tim and Alison as she made her way through the tunnel. Concussed and bleeding, she'd been led from the train by the driver and ended up stuck directly outside the bombed carriage.
I was looking at the girl in front of me, the woman, and she turned her head like that. And as she looked into the carriage, her face just crumpled and she began to cry. And I knew she'd seen something bad, but I couldn't stop myself. So I looked, and then I began to cry. When I looked, I didn't see anybody alive in there.
Inside the bombed carriage, the rescuers and the injured were waiting for help. But Jackie didn't see them. Terrified, she wanted to get out of there. But a seriously injured man was being treated on the tracks, blocking the way out. Jackie wanted to help, but she was told by the man's rescuers to step over him.
I will never, ever forget that. We were like zombies. What lives with you is that you couldn't do anything. And somehow you think, well, I should have been able to summon up this superhuman quality and knowledge and been effective. But you can't. You can't. You can't do anything. And you have to live with it.
As he sat alone with Alison, Tim watched quietly as the other passengers made their way out of the tunnel.
They were going to their families and to their friends and to their loved ones, and they could have a hug. I couldn't do that just now. And I wondered where Judy was, my wife. I wondered how I could ever get hold of her. I couldn't find my children at that point. And so I had to put them into park, which was a very hard thing to do when you're so involved with a passion of bringing children into the world and sharing your life with someone else. You want them as part of your life, and you want to let them know that you're hurting so that they can help you. That time was hard because it wasn't really time for me, and I had to accept that I had those thoughts, but I couldn't. The time was now to look after Alison and to survive.
Back in the carriage, Jason Rennie had spent nearly 3/4 of an hour helping to keep David Gardner alive. But now it seemed that time was running out.
The most emotional time while I was down there was probably when I came to the realization that there is a real possibility David could die. And yet, up until this particular point, I hadn't really considered it. I hadn't within myself accepted that that was a possibility.
In the darkness, the two strangers had become friends.
I can't remember whether he said tell Angela or whether he said tell my wife. I think he said tell my wife that I love her. And I said to him, David, that's not happening. I said, I'm not prepared to entertain that. I said, you hang in there. The paramedics are coming in. I'm going to come and see you in Julius Caesar, later on. And I started getting quite upset then. I started actually getting a bit angry. It's different if you know someone for a very short period of time. You don't get to know them. They pass away. You can kind of distance yourself from that. But you get to know someone. You find out they've got family, what their life's about, that you have something in common with them. And they die after that. I kind of, on a selfish level, thought that'd be quite tough to take, But also I was angry because I thought, man, where are the paramedics?
Then at last the paramedics arrived and made their way along the tunnel towards the bombed carriage. They immediately got to work, administering the expert help that the injured so desperately needed. It had been a long wait for the injured passengers, and their rescuers weren't going to leave them until they were absolutely sure they were going to get out alive. Susanna Pell stayed in the tunnel with the man she'd rescued, holding his hand, trying to keep him conscious. They were eventually led back onto the train and walked through the carriages, finally escaping into the daylight at Edgware Road Station.
It was only when I got off the platform, off the tracks, clambered up to the platform with the help of people pulling me out, and went through the barrier out again into the train station entrance. That was really when it hit me. And that was the point when I welled up and I just let it all out. The relief that I was safe, that I was okay, and just finally was able to cry because I hadn't been able to up to that point. I had to maintain focus, and finally I could let it all out.
Shocked, cut and bleeding, Susanna was offered an ambulance ride to hospital.
I was like, oh, I don't want an ambulance, I don't need an ambulance, I'm fine, I can walk. And at the back of my mind, I just knew there was people down there that really needed ambulances, and the last thing I wanted was an ambulance to take me anywhere. I just wanted to get home and sort of get home and change and have a cup of tea and see my family.
When paramedics finally reached David Gardner, he had almost lost consciousness. Now, as Jason and the paramedics lifted David onto a stretcher, it was at last safe for him to give in.
I just remember being lifted by these guys strong, being still alive, being still awake, and also Jane saying to me, my paramedic, now you can go to sleep, as it were. We've stabilized you. We don't have to sort of, I think she told Jason or people to stop saying, hello, David, are you right? David, are you okay? I'm with you, David. And I always remember that extraordinary journey, buffeted about a bit when they kept hold of me, through the carriage, onto the train line, down the train passage, onto the platform, up the steps at Edgware Road, and into that glorious sunlight. I always remember just seeing the sunlight shoved in the back of a, I think still with Jane on it, back of a ambulance, and then driven to sort of safety. I was shown such love by these people, these unknown people.
Together with a paramedic, Tim Coulson carried Alison out of the tunnel to safety. He only let go of her hand when she was taken away for an operation at St Mary's Hospital.
I can only suggest that the reason that I fell apart at that particular point was that the person in my charge and in my right hand was now in very much safer hands and being attended to extremely well. My prayer had been answered, which was that no one else was going to die if I could help it. If I could stop just one more, that would be good.
After his heroic actions on the 7th of July 2005, Tim Coulson began to suffer the after effects. He was so traumatized that he had to give up the teaching job he loved. Now, Tim finds comfort in his daily walks along the River Thames. For nearly 3 years, Tim's sacrifice went completely unrecognized. The only thing he had to show for his actions was a heartfelt letter of thanks he received from Alison, the woman whose life he had saved. We asked him to read that letter for us.
It is hard to put into words the kind of gratitude I feel towards Tim. He didn't have to venture into our tube. He didn't have to continue to help after seeing the scene of our carriage and after trying to help another person who wasn't as lucky and died in his arms. I'm immune to those memories as I was unconscious. I don't have to live with the images that Tim has for the rest of his life. The majority of my scars are physical, and I had no choice. Tim's are emotional, and he had a choice. I'm forever grateful that Tim made the choice that day to help, and can't imagine how much worse the 7th of July could have been for me if no one had been holding my hand tightly all that day. Tim is indeed the bravest person I've known, and I feel he deserves the recognition for his bravery. Sorry, chaps. It's not how you pronounce recognition, is it? It's hard to hear people tell you how brave you've been, because you don't believe it. And I didn't believe it for about 2 years and 8 months, or whatever it's been. You don't do it to be brave, really. You do it because you care for human beings. All those cries of human suffering that you have to relieve, they're not things you should normally hear, really. I told you it's never easy.
In May 2008, Tim was finally honoured for his bravery, receiving a medal from the Royal Humane Society. After the bombing, Susanna Pell went on to get a job in the art world. She was incredibly lucky not to be scarred after hundreds of tiny pieces of glass were removed from her face. 3 years on, the friendships she made on 7/7 have allowed her to see the good that came out of the tragedy.
And that's just one of the best things about the whole experience of 7/7 was that the friendships and the bonds that people made, and the unique experience that we all had. That's one of the best things that come out of it, is that sense of you take a random group of people on a tube and you actually break down the barriers, literally, and you get to know who these people are. If you'd asked me before that day how I would have responded in such a situation, I'd have no idea. And let alone thought that I would have responded how I did. So in many ways it's a really affirming experience that you feel strong, and it's something you can draw on in life now as a real resource of strength.
Despite the fact that Jackie Putnam did what so many of us would have done, she has been deeply upset that she didn't help the injured. The experience inspired her to join the Red Cross, and she is now a fully qualified first aid instructor.
And I still feel it's not enough. It's never going to be enough. It's never, ever, nothing I do now is ever going to make up for the fact that I couldn't do anything on the morning of the 7th of July. I don't know where this journey is going to end. I don't know where normality is for me, where it's going to settle. But I hope that when it does settle, I'm all ready, and they're not going to catch me out like that again. If I'm in another incident like that, I will be more effective, and I will be able to do something.
This photograph of Jason Rennie was taken in casualty on the morning of 7/7, where shards of metal were removed from his face, his wrist and his leg. Despite his injuries, he still found the courage to help others that morning. Now living in Dubai, Jason remains in regular contact with his friend David Gardner, and today he returns to London to see him.
I'm interested to see him again, because a lot's happened between now and the last time that I saw him. I must admit, I had a fair bit of apprehension about the first time I went and saw David. The London Underground isn't known for people even looking at each other. You know, you try not even make eye contact with them, even if they're in front of you. I felt as though in a very short space of time we got to know quite a bit about each other, but I didn't know whether, you know, that would be the only thing we'd have in common when we met. But as it turns out, I didn't really have to worry about that. You know, David was a tremendous, an amazing person, and we just got on very well, and his wife's great. David, how are you?
Hello, Jason. Great to see you. Oh, God, how are you this morning? Lovely to see you. People don't know who sits next to them. I didn't. I didn't know to my left, a little bit away, was a bomber. How are you doing?
Oh, this is a new place.
This is our new place.
Very nice.
I didn't know there was a South African on the train who was going to help me. And all those people put down whatever they were doing, or even if they were terribly injured. They helped. What for? They could have escaped it. It wasn't for themselves. And I sort of relished it. I sort of felt that it was there in a lot of people, and it's great to see it come out So it wasn't hatred that came out of that day, it was love.
David Gardner lost his leg after the bombing, but with the help of Jason Rennie and the medical team who cared for him afterwards, he was able to return to his family. He finally got to put on his play in the summer of 2006, but the effects of 7/7 will remain with him forever.
I always hear people talk about wanting to move on from it, whatever. I never will, and I'm grateful I don't move on because my memories of it are of the extraordinary qualities in people. You know, I got through something terrible, and with the help of a lot of people that I love.
At home in North London, David and Angela are now expecting their second child. 3 years after the bombing, they're looking forward to a long and happy future together.
I remember saying I wanted to live, you know, for my wife, for our marriage. I wanted to live for my child. There's a great boy already, Matthew, and I'm sure would be even greater. I wouldn't want to miss anything of that. And if anything can get you through, I suspect that can. And as me, as a small unit within that experience, that day, you know, I saw some terrific things.
So for some at Edgware Road, on the London Underground, the 7th of July 2005 reaffirmed their faith in human nature.
And if that's the world underneath that sort of quiet carriage, you know, worrying about the day to come and how they're feeling, underneath all that are some amazing people. You know, and I think we've got to be happy about that, proud of that, and that's worth living for, so that they're still around in this world.